May 19th, 1536. Anne Boleyn's head is severed. But witnesses saw something that haunted them forever. Her lips kept moving, her eyes opened, and she seemed desperately trying to speak. Modern science now confirms the horrifying truth about those final seconds, and what her head was trying to reveal might explain why it mysteriously vanished from history. 8 o'clock in the morning, Tower Green. The French swordsman from Calais raises his blade, a weapon so sharp it was said to slice through bone like silk. Anne Boleyn kneels upright, her gray damask gown carefully arranged around her. Her eyes are covered with a blindfold. She's praying aloud, her voice steady, almost unnaturally calm for a woman about to die. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The words flow from her lips in a rhythmic prayer she's repeated countless times throughout her life. In one fluid motion, the executioner swings. The blade passes through her neck so cleanly that witnesses later said they barely saw it move. Her head separates from her body and falls to the straw-covered scaffold. This should be the end of the story. This should be where Anne Boleyn's consciousness ends, where her awareness ceases, where death takes her instantly. But it wasn't. What happened in the next few seconds would haunt every person who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. And what they saw would be documented, whispered about, and debated for nearly 500 years. The official executioner, along with several guards and approximately 1,000 spectators crowded around the scaffold, all saw the same impossible thing. Anne Boleyn's severed head, now separated from her body, showed signs of life. Her lips continued moving, not random muscle spasms, actual deliberate movements, as if she was still trying to complete the prayer she'd been reciting when the blade struck. Several witnesses who were standing closest to the scaffold reported that her mouth formed words for what seemed like an eternity but was probably closer to 15 or 20 seconds. Her eyelids fluttered open. One account from a guard stationed directly beside the scaffold stated that her eyes appeared to focus briefly, moving slightly as if trying to see her surroundings. Another witness, a nobleman whose name was lost to history but whose account was recorded in a letter dated just 3 days after the execution, wrote that Anne's face showed what he described as recognition and terror. Her cheeks, pale from blood loss, seemed to twitch and move in ways that couldn't be explained by simple nerve death. The executioner himself, a professional who had performed dozens of beheadings in France, reportedly refused to touch her head immediately after, backing away from it with visible distress. He later told other Tower officials that in all his years of performing executions, he had never seen a head react that way for so long. The crowd stood in absolute silence. No one cheered. No one celebrated the death of the woman many had called a homewrecker, a heretic, an upstart who destroyed England's relationship with Rome. They just stared in horror at what they were witnessing. Anne's body remained kneeling upright for several seconds after her head fell, blood pumping from the neck in rhythmic spurts that matched what would have been her final heartbeats. But it was the head that captured everyone's attention. The head that shouldn't be moving. The head that, according to everything they understood about death, should be still and lifeless. Several women in the crowd reportedly fainted. Men who had served in wars, who had seen death countless times, turned away unable to watch. The archbishop who was present to pray over her soul stopped mid-prayer, his voice dying in his throat as he witnessed something that seemed to defy God's natural order. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Anne Boleyn's case wasn't unique, and modern science has now proven that what those witnesses saw wasn't supernatural at all. It was something far more terrifying. Anne Boleyn was still conscious. Your brain can survive without your body. That's not a horror movie premise, that's medical fact. When the guillotine became the execution method of choice during the French Revolution, doctors and scientists finally had the opportunity to study what happens to human consciousness after decapitation. What they discovered was nightmare fuel. The human brain stores enough oxygenated blood to remain conscious for approximately 7 to 30 seconds after complete separation from the body. Think about that. 7 to 30 seconds of full awareness. That's enough time to think multiple complete thoughts. That's enough time to feel pain, to experience terror, to understand what has just happened to you. In 1905, a French doctor named Bourrieu conducted an experiment that would be considered horrifically unethical today, but provided crucial scientific data. A convicted murderer named Henry Longueuil was guillotined, and Bourrieu was positioned immediately beside the basket where the head fell. The moment the head dropped, he began calling the man's name. "Longueuil, Longueuil," and the head responded. The eyelids lifted. The eyes focused on Bourrieu's face. It happened twice. The doctor documented that the eyes weren't just opening randomly, they were tracking, focusing, showing clear signs of intelligent response to external stimuli. The science behind this horror is actually straightforward. Your brain is the last organ to die. When your head is severed from your body, your heart obviously stops pumping blood immediately. But the blood that was already in your brain, approximately 150 milliliters of oxygenated blood, remains there. Brain cells can function on that reserve supply for a brief but measurable period. During those seconds, neural activity continues. The visual cortex processes what the eyes see. The auditory cortex processes sounds. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for consciousness and thought, remains active. You can think, you can feel, you can understand. But here's the truly horrifying part. You can't do anything about it. You have no vocal cords to scream, no lungs to breathe, no body to move. You're trapped in your own head, fully aware, experiencing the ultimate helplessness. Research conducted on laboratory animals in controlled settings has confirmed that brain activity continues for up to 29 seconds after decapitation. EEG readings show clear patterns of consciousness, not just random electrical noise, but organized brainwaves consistent with awareness. Neurologists who have studied these patterns describe it as one of the most disturbing findings in medical science, because it means that every single person who has ever been beheaded throughout human history experienced those final seconds of conscious awareness. Now apply this science to Anne Boleyn. She knelt on that scaffold, praying, her mind focused on her final words to God. The blade struck so quickly she likely didn't even feel the initial cut. The sword was that sharp, the executioner that skilled. But then came the awareness. The sudden disconnect. The realization that she could see the scaffold from a different angle, could see her own body still kneeling, blood pumping from her neck. Her brain still processing information, still conscious, still trying to complete the prayer she'd been reciting. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. But she had no voice. No breath, no way to finish the words. Her lips moved automatically, muscle memory trying to complete the familiar prayer, even as her brain screamed in the realization of what had happened. Can you imagine that level of horror? Can you imagine being Anne Boleyn in that moment? Understanding that you've been executed, seeing your own body separate from you, and being completely unable to scream or cry, or do anything except exist in that state of pure terror for what must have felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 to 20 seconds. That's what modern neuroscience tells us she experienced. That's the terrifying truth that those witnesses saw playing out on her face. But Anne's execution had peculiar details that made her case different from every other beheading in Tudor England. And those details might explain why what happened to her head was even more extreme than normal. Henry VIII made bizarre choices regarding Anne's execution. First, he imported a swordsman from Calais, France. This wasn't standard procedure. English executions used axes, always. The axe was the traditional tool for noble executions, and Tower Hill had a permanent chopping block for exactly this purpose. But Henry specifically requested, and paid a significant amount of money for, an expert swordsman to be brought from France. The official reason given was mercy. A sword being lighter and sharper than an axe could supposedly sever a head more cleanly and quickly, causing less suffering. But here's what doesn't add up. If Henry truly cared about Anne's suffering, why did he put her through a mock execution the day before? Anne was told her execution would happen at noon on May 18th. She prepared herself mentally and spiritually. She said her goodbyes. She accepted her fate. Then at the last minute, she was told there was a delay. The executioner hadn't arrived yet. She would die the next morning instead. Can you imagine the psychological torture of that? Preparing to die, accepting death, reaching a state of readiness, and then being told you have to wait another night, another morning, more hours of terror and anticipation. Some historians believe this delay was deliberate, designed to break her psychologically, to make her confess to the crimes she'd been accused of, or perhaps just to maximize her suffering as punishment for refusing to go quietly. The sword versus axe debate is more significant than it might seem. An axe requires the victim to place their head on a wooden block. The executioner swings downward, using gravity and force to chop through the neck. It's brutal, often imprecise. Many executions required multiple blows. The condemned would feel the first strike, then the second, sometimes 3 or 4 attempts before the head fully separated. It was messy, painful, and prolonged. But a sword is different. The victim kneels upright. The executioner swings horizontally at neck level. The blade is much sharper and lighter, moving faster. The cut is cleaner. And here's the crucial detail. A cleaner cut means less immediate trauma to the brain. An axe crushing through neck bones sends massive shockwaves through the spinal cord and brainstem, potentially causing more immediate loss of consciousness from the sheer physical trauma. But a sword slicing cleanly through soft tissue and cartilage causes minimal shock to the brain itself. The brain continues functioning more normally because it hasn't been physically traumatized by blunt force, which means that Anne Boleyn's brain likely remained more conscious for longer than if she'd been executed with an axe. Henry's choice of the sword, whether he intended it or not, may have ensured that Anne experienced maximum conscious awareness during those final seconds after her head was severed. So when those witnesses saw Anne's lips moving, her eyes opening, her face showing expressions, they weren't seeing supernatural phenomena. They were seeing the medical reality of a brain that was still alive, still processing, still desperately trying to function despite being separated from the body that sustained it. They were seeing a woman who understood she'd been killed and was trapped in those final moments of fading consciousness. But here's where Anne's case becomes truly unique. Her head vanished, completely, without a trace. And that disappearance has fueled centuries of speculation about what she experienced, what she might have tried to communicate, and what secrets died with her in those final conscious seconds. Before we get to that mystery, though, we need to talk about what Anne's moving lips were actually trying to say. Because the prayer she was reciting when the blade fell holds a clue to understanding what her final thoughts might have been. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. These were the words flowing from Anne Boleyn's mouth when the French sword severed her neck. It wasn't a random prayer. Anne had chosen these specific words carefully, rehearsing them, preparing them as her final statement before death. In Tudor England, your final words mattered enormously. They were believed to reflect the state of your soul, to indicate whether you would be received into heaven or cast into hell. Anne's prayer was a direct plea to Christ, bypassing the Catholic Church's traditional intercession of saints. This was significant. Even in death, Anne was making a Protestant statement, aligning herself with the Reformed faith that she and Henry had helped establish in England. But here's what haunted those witnesses. After her head fell, her lips continued forming these words. Multiple accounts describe the same thing. Her mouth moved in the familiar pattern of the prayer she'd been speaking. One witness, a lady-in-waiting who had served Anne for years, reported that she could see the words being formed silently. She spoke the prayer still, though no sound came forth. Another account from a guard stated that he counted approximately 15 movements of her lips after decapitation, which would align almost perfectly with the time it would take to complete the final line of her prayer. Think about what this means psychologically. Anne's brain, still conscious, still processing information, was also still executing the deeply ingrained automatic behavior of prayer. She had repeated this prayer thousands of times throughout her life. It was muscle memory, yes, but it was also conscious, intentional prayer in her final moment. Her dying brain was trying desperately to complete the task it had begun. Some witnesses reported something even more specific. They claimed her lips moved not just in the pattern of her prayer, but seemed to form additional words afterward. A nobleman who stood on the scaffold itself, positioned directly behind where Anne knelt, wrote in his personal diary that after the prayer movement stopped, her mouth opened once more and appeared to form a single word. He couldn't determine what word it was. There was no sound, no breath to carry the word, but he was convinced she was trying to say something beyond the prayer. What could it have been? Was it a name? Henry's name? Her daughter Elizabeth's name? Was it a protest of innocence, or perhaps something more shocking, a revelation she wanted to share but couldn't complete before her consciousness faded? We'll never know for certain. But the fact that multiple witnesses saw her lips continue moving for so long suggests that Anne's conscious mind was still trying to communicate, even as her physical ability to do so disappeared. The prayer itself takes approximately 30 seconds to recite at normal speaking pace. Anne was approximately halfway through when the blade struck, which means if she had remained conscious for the scientifically plausible 15 to 20 seconds after decapitation, she theoretically could have completed the entire prayer in her dying mind. But what happens psychologically when you're trying to complete a prayer while simultaneously experiencing the horror of realizing you've been beheaded? Neurologists who study extreme trauma have found that the human brain has an incredible capacity to focus on routine behaviors during moments of crisis. Soldiers in combat report that they automatically followed training procedures even while being shot at. Their conscious minds almost disconnected from the terror of the situation. Victims of car accidents describe thinking about mundane details. I need to pick up groceries. even as their car was spinning out of control. The brain clings to normalcy, to routine, to familiar patterns as a defense mechanism against overwhelming trauma. For Anne, that familiar pattern was prayer. Her brain, confronted with the incomprehensible reality of her situation, may have clung to the one thing it knew how to do: continue praying. But witnesses also reported something else about Anne's head that goes beyond the movement of lips. Something that suggested more than automatic muscle memory was happening. Something that indicated active, conscious thought in those final seconds. Her eyes. Multiple accounts describe Anne's eyes opening after her head fell. This wasn't the random eye movement sometimes seen in dead bodies. This was deliberate. One witness described it as the eyes of one who suddenly wakes. Another account stated that her eyes did seem to cast about, as if searching for something. A third witness, a priest who stood nearby to pray for her soul, wrote that he saw her eyes open and appear to focus briefly on the sky above the scaffold, before closing again. Eyes don't just randomly open and focus after death. That requires active neural control. The muscles that control eye movement, 6 separate muscles for each eye, require coordinated signals from the brainstem and visual cortex. When those muscles moved, when Anne's eyes opened and appeared to look around, it meant her visual cortex was still processing information. It meant she could still see. Imagine that moment from Anne's perspective. You're praying, you feel nothing, the sword is too sharp, too fast. Then suddenly your perspective shifts. You're seeing everything from a different angle. Lower. You can see your own body still kneeling. You can see blood. You can see the horrified faces of the crowd. You try to understand what's happening. You try to move, but nothing responds. And then you realize you've been executed. You're still conscious. You're still aware. But you're just ahead. Several witnesses reported what they described as an expression of knowledge passing over Anne's face. That phrase appeared in at least 3 separate written accounts from people who were present at the execution. An expression of knowledge. What did that mean? Some interpreted it as Anne's soul, recognizing that death had come and accepting it. Others believed it was something darker, the realization and horror of understanding what had happened to her. One account goes further, describing what the witness called terrible recognition and despair in her eyes before they closed for the final time. But here's the detail that makes this even more chilling. Some witnesses claimed they saw tears, actual tears forming in Anne's eyes after her head had been severed from her body. The lacrimal glands, which produce tears, require blood flow to function. A severed head has no active blood flow, the heart isn't pumping anymore. So tears should be impossible. Yet multiple witnesses reported seeing moisture in Anne's eyes. Can this be explained? Possibly. The lacrimal glands might have had residual fluid that could have been released through muscle contractions as the tissues died. Or the witnesses might have been mistaken, seeing blood or other fluids and interpreting them as tears through the lens of the emotionally overwhelming moment. But if those witnesses were accurate, if tears really did form in Anne's eyes after decapitation, it would suggest something even more disturbing. Emotional processing was still happening in her dying brain. Anne Boleyn wasn't the only person in history whose severed head showed signs of consciousness. Throughout the centuries, particularly during the French Revolution, when guillotines were running daily, similar accounts piled up. Charlotte Corday is perhaps the most famous case. In 1793, she assassinated Jean-Paul Marat, a radical journalist, by stabbing him in his bathtub. She was guillotined for the murder. After her head fell into the basket, one of the executioner's assistants, a man named François Legros, picked up her head and slapped both cheeks hard. The crowd gasped in horror because Charlotte's face reacted. Her cheeks flushed red. Her expression changed from peaceful to what witnesses described as pure indignation and rage. Her eyes, which had been closed, snapped open and appeared to glare at the man who had struck her. The crowd erupted. Some people fainted. Others shouted in fury at Legros for this desecration. Legros himself was reportedly shaken, pale and disturbed by what he'd witnessed. He claimed afterward that he felt the head move in his hands, not just falling or rolling, but actively responding to the slap. That expression of rage on Charlotte's face was documented by dozens of witnesses, including doctors who were present. It couldn't be dismissed as imagination or superstition. Something had happened. Then there's Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry. Before his execution by guillotine in 1794, Lavoisier made an arrangement with a colleague. He said he would try to blink his eyes for as long as possible after his head was severed. His colleague would count the blinks and record them for science. After the blade fell, Lavoisier's head landed in the basket. And then, according to multiple witnesses, including his colleague who stood at the base of the scaffold, Lavoisier's eyes began blinking. Deliberately, rhythmically. His colleague counted 15 to 20 distinct blinks over approximately 11 to 15 seconds before the eyelids stopped moving. This wasn't random. This was a conscious man following through on an experiment, even as he died. He was proving with his final moments of awareness that consciousness persisted after decapitation. The revolutionary authorities tried to suppress this account, afraid it would turn public opinion against the guillotine. But the witnesses spoke anyway, and the story spread throughout Europe. Scientists and philosophers debated the implications. If Lavoisier could consciously control his eyelids for 15 seconds after losing his head, what else was he experiencing? Was he in pain? Could he think? Did he understand what had happened? The questions haunted educated Europeans for decades. There are even stranger cases. Diogo Alves was a Portuguese serial killer executed in 1841. For reasons lost to history, his head was preserved in a jar of formaldehyde and kept at the University of Lisbon Medical School. For years afterward, there were persistent rumors and reports from medical students and faculty that Alves's preserved head would occasionally open its eyes. The stories were so widespread that the head became known as the head that watches. Was there any truth to these accounts? Almost certainly not. Dead tissue preserved in formaldehyde doesn't spontaneously animate. But the fact that these stories persisted, that people genuinely believed they saw the eyes open, reveals something important: the collective psychological trauma and horror surrounding severed heads that showed signs of life. These stories spread because people had witnessed real cases like Anne Boleyn, Charlotte Corday, and Antoine Lavoisier. They had seen heads that moved, that reacted, that appeared conscious, and once you've witnessed that, your mind doesn't forget it. You become hyper-vigilant, looking for signs of life even where none exist. The line between the living and the dead becomes terrifyingly unclear. And that brings us back to Anne. Her case combined all these elements: moving lips, opening eyes, changing expressions, and the reports of tears. But Anne's execution had additional strained circumstances that made it different from every other documented case of post-decapitation consciousness. Henry VIII went to extraordinary lengths to control Anne's execution. The imported French swordsman was just the beginning. Henry also issued specific orders about the timing and audience. The execution was scheduled for very early in the morning, 8 a.m., unusual for executions, which typically happened at noon. The crowd was deliberately limited to approximately 1,000 people, far fewer than the crowds that gathered for other high-profile executions. Why? Some historians believe Henry wanted to minimize the number of witnesses. He knew Anne was intelligent, charismatic, and skilled at public speaking. He feared she might use her final moments to proclaim her innocence in a way that would sway public opinion. By limiting the crowd and scheduling the execution early, he reduced the risk of her final words spreading too widely too quickly. But here's the truly bizarre detail. Anne was told the execution would be delayed until the following day, then was suddenly informed the morning of May 19th that it would happen immediately. She had been expecting more time. She was rushed to the scaffold with minimal preparation. This wasn't mercy, this was psychological warfare. Henry wanted her off balance, confused, unable to prepare a final speech or statement. He wanted control over even her death. The French swordsman himself is a mystery. We don't know his name. We know he was paid well. Henry VIII's financial records show a significant payment made to the executioner of Calais around this time. We know he was considered an expert, someone who had performed many executions and could guarantee a clean single stroke. But why go to all this trouble and expense? Some historians have suggested darker theories. What if Henry wanted Anne's head intact for some specific purpose? An axe, even wielded by an expert, damages the skull, shatters bones, leaves the head mangled. But a sword leaves the head pristine, undamaged, just separated from the body. Did Henry plan to preserve Anne's head somehow? Did he want it for a trophy, for proof of her death, for some ritual or symbolic purpose? We know that traitors' heads were typically boiled, tarred, and displayed on spikes at London Bridge. Their heads stayed there for months, sometimes years, as warnings to others. Anne's head should have been displayed the same way. She'd been convicted of high treason after all, but it wasn't. Instead, something else happened that has never been adequately explained. The moment after Anne's head fell, there was confusion on the scaffold. The executioner stepped back, as mentioned before, apparently disturbed by the head's continued movements. Guards rushed forward to collect her body. But in standard execution protocol, the head should have been immediately shown to the crowd. The executioner traditionally holds the severed head aloft and declares, "Behold the head of a traitor," or similar words. It's part of the ritual, part of the public spectacle and warning. This didn't happen with Anne. Instead, according to witness accounts, her head was quickly wrapped in cloth and placed in the arrow chest along with her body. The whole package was hurried to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the tower grounds. The burial happened within hours. No ceremony, no royal protocol, no lying in state, just a hasty, almost panicked disposal of the body. Why the rush? Some historians argue it was because Henry had already moved on mentally and emotionally. He was engaged to Jane Seymour and wanted to marry her as quickly as possible. Annie needed to be buried and forgotten fast so he could start his new life. But others point to a more sinister explanation. The witnesses had seen too much. Anne's head had shown too much consciousness, too much awareness, too much life after death. It was disturbing people, it was causing questions. It needed to be hidden away before those questions spread too widely. Here's where the mystery deepens into something almost inexplicable. After Anne's burial in that arrow chest, her head disappears from historical record. Completely. In every other Tudor execution of a noble or royal person, there are detailed records of what happened to the body and head. Where they were buried, whether they were moved later, whether family members retrieved them for proper burial elsewhere. Thomas More's head, for example, was rescued by his daughter Margaret and is allegedly preserved to this day at St. Dunstan's Church in Canterbury. Thomas Cromwell's body was buried at the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, just like Anne's, and his grave location was documented and later confirmed. But Anne's head? Nothing. No documentation, no grave markers, no church records indicating it was kept separate from her body. No family members claiming it for reburial. When Queen Victoria ordered renovations of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula in the 1870s, workers discovered multiple remains in unmarked graves. One skeleton, believed to be Anne Boleyn based on historical records and the location within the chapel, was found. It had a notably slender neck and was missing several teeth, consistent with contemporary descriptions of Anne. But here's the horrifying detail. The skeleton appeared to be complete with a skull. However, the skull's connection to the rest of the skeleton was questionable, and some historians believe the skull found with the body wasn't Anne's original head. Why would anyone doubt the skull found with Anne's body? Because when bodies are hastily buried in arrow chests without coffins, bones scatter and shift over centuries. The chapel of St. Peter at Vincula has multiple bodies buried in close proximity, some in marked graves, many in unmarked. Bones mixed together. During the Victorian renovation, workers found multiple skulls and skeletal remains in the general area where Anne was believed to be buried. The skeleton identified as Anne could have been matched with the wrong skull. Or worse, her head might never have been buried there at all. Think about the timeline. Anne is executed at 8 a.m. Witnesses see her head showing signs of consciousness that disturb everyone present. Her body and head are wrapped quickly and moved to the chapel within hours. But what happened in those hours? Who had access to the body? Who specifically handled her head? The historical record is mysteriously silent on these details. We know that certain ladies-in-waiting and servants prepared bodies for burial in Tudor times. We know that priests would have performed rites over the remains. But we have no specific names, no specific accounts of who touched Anne's body or head after the execution. That absence of documentation is itself suspicious in an era when everything else was meticulously recorded. Then there are the ghost stories. For nearly 500 years, Anne Boleyn's ghost has been reported at the Tower of London more frequently than any other specter. Dozens, possibly hundreds of credible witnesses have reported seeing her. And here's the consistent detail that appears in these accounts. She's either carrying her head or searching for it. In 1864, a guardsman at the tower saw a figure in Tudor dress walking through the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. The figure appeared to be glowing with a strange light. The guard watched as the figure walked the length of the chapel, then suddenly vanished. The guard reported the incident, was disciplined for drinking on duty, and insisted he'd been sober. He was so shaken that he requested a transfer from the tower. In the 1960s and 70s, several independent psychic investigators visited the tower specifically to try to contact Anne's spirit. Multiple investigators, working separately and unaware of each other's findings, reported the same message. Anne's spirit was looking for something. When asked what, the consistent answer was her head or the truth. One investigator reported that Anne's spirit seemed confused, disoriented, as if she couldn't understand what had happened to her or where parts of her body had gone. These accounts can be dismissed as superstition or fraud, certainly. But the consistency is striking, and it aligns with something traumatic. If Anne experienced full consciousness for 15 to 20 seconds after her head was severed, if she saw her own body, understood what had happened, and then her consciousness faded while still separated from her body, what kind of psychological trauma would that create? What kind of unresolved energy might remain? Which brings us to the final, most disturbing question. What did Anne Boleyn know? What secret was worth all this effort to silence her? To hide her head? To erase her so completely from history? Anne was no fool. She was educated, intelligent, politically savvy. She'd spent years navigating the most dangerous court in Europe. By the time of her execution, she knew things. She knew about Henry's physical problems. There were persistent rumors that he was impotent with her toward the end of their marriage, a detail that would have devastated his masculine image if it became public. She knew about court conspiracies about which nobles secretly supported the old Catholic faith versus the new Protestant reforms. She knew about financial corruption, about who was stealing from the crown, about which ambassadors were lying to Henry. She had read correspondence, attended private meetings, been present for conversations between Henry and his advisors that were supposed to remain secret. And most importantly, she knew the truth about her own charges. She knew she was innocent of adultery and incest. She knew the evidence had been fabricated. She knew exactly who had orchestrated her downfall and why. If Anne had 30 seconds of consciousness after her head was severed, if she was still trying to speak, what would she have said? Would she have named Thomas Cromwell as her murderer? Would she have proclaimed her innocence one final time? Would she have revealed some devastating secret about Henry that would have changed English history? We'll never know. Because whatever final thoughts formed in Anne Boleyn's dying brain, whatever words her lips tried to form, whatever truth she tried to reveal in those horrifying final seconds of awareness, it died with her. Her head, the vessel that contained those final conscious thoughts, vanished from history. And 500 years later, we're still searching for it. Still wondering what secrets it might have revealed. Still haunted by the image of a severed head trying desperately to speak, to warn, to accuse, even as consciousness faded forever. If you found this story as disturbing and fascinating as I did researching it, hit that subscribe button right now, because we dive into historical mysteries that will change how you see the past. Drop a comment below telling me what you think happened to Anne's head and whether you believe she was really conscious in those final seconds. And smash that like button if you want more deep dives into the terrifying truths hiding behind famous historical events. This is history they didn't teach you in school, and there's so much more to uncover.